Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to Anita Dunn. She's a senior advisor to President Biden, and she joins us this morning from Chevy Chase, Maryland. Good morning to you. I assume it was a late night for you. Given that Democrats have defied expectations, you still will have only a thin majority in the Senate. Republicans still have a shot at gaining the House. What becomes possible now?
You know, the president and the Democrats accomplished a huge amount with a 50-50 Senate and an extremely narrow House majority in the first 2 years of President Biden's term. So, you know, the president's been clear, as he was in his press conference this week, Margaret, which is he's going to reach out his hand to work with the Republicans. And the question is whether they will reach out their hand to his. But given these narrow majorities, you know, obviously the Senate, Democrats will control. The House is still up in the air. Voters in this country are going to expect their leaders to work together.
The president has said he wants to take it slow in terms of defining priorities over the next few weeks in this lame duck session. What's the business you need to get done?
Well, Margaret, as you know, we have to keep the government open and funded. That is obviously priority number one. And it's going to take a little while still for lame duck priorities to really be set, given the uncertainty about the outcomes of the election still. I don't think anybody would have predicted that we would still not know who would control the United States House of Representatives the following Sunday. But other lame duck priorities will certainly include additional funding for Ukraine, which has been, and the president has said he hopes will continue to be, a bipartisan issue in the United States Congress. You know, obviously, emergency funding for the natural disasters that Florida and Puerto Rico suffered earlier this year, and additional priorities for the administration as well. But keep the government open and running is the number one priority.
It looks like Democrats owe a big part of their better than expected performance to young voters who turned out. About 26 million Americans are now stuck in limbo because they'd been promised student debt relief. Now it's caught up in the courts. If you lose in court, I know you're waiting for that, will this just be a broken promise?
So, Margaret, we believe we're going to prevail in court because the arguments and the law are on the administration's side, and make no mistake about it. President Biden made this commitment to people in America. Is not just young people. It's also people of every age. We've gotten letters at the White House from people who have retired, who are talking about what a difference loan forgiveness is going to make.
But is there a plan B if the court strikes it down?
We're not going to back down. We believe we're going to prevail in court. And at that point, we will swiftly move to make sure that the over 26 million people at this point whose information this administration has, that will move swiftly for loan forgiveness.
Voters in key states like Pennsylvania rated abortion access as a top concern for them. But if Republicans take the House, what is it that the president can actually do here? And is there room for compromise on restrictions with some of the Republicans who said they're open to securing abortion access?
So the president has been very clear. He believes Congress needs to codify Roe versus Wade so that it is the national law of the land. And he has said if Democrats control the House and the Senate, that he will send a bill to codify this nationally. He will continue to work, as our administration has since this ruling came down, to make sure that the travel of women who want to go to states where abortion is legal is not impeded, that people are able to get reproductive health care, that women who have other medical issues aren't denied care, which is happening, Margaret. And at the end of the day, you know, the president said when this ruling came down, it was going to be a political issue that voters needed to go to the polls and make their voices heard. And there's a huge amount of evidence that's exactly what happened. So the real question is whether the Republicans will listen to those voices.
Well, we'll see if there's any compromise there. On what happens if the Republicans do get this slim majority, it ups the chances of all of these investigations that Kevin McCarthy has promised are coming. Would you say today that the White House will comply with them? The Trump administration was heavily criticized for defying Congress's request for appearances and documents. Will the Biden White House comply?
You know, Margaret, many of the Republicans who have been talking about these investigations and even potential impeachment have made no secret of the fact that they have a political agenda, that they are trying to advance through these. Obviously, the White House has and will continue to apply with fair and legitimate oversight, because we are a White House that respects norms and the rule of law. But I think that, the American people didn't vote for Congress being used to conduct political vendettas over the next 2 years. They voted for.
I know we're still counting votes from this election, but as you know, former President Trump plans to announce he's running in 2024 this Tuesday. You've already been involved, as you said, just being prudent, in planning for President Biden to also run. Does the Trump announcement change any part of your planning or calculus?
The president has made it clear he intends to run and that he will make a formal decision later this year or early next year. You don't run for president because of what the other side is doing or what another candidate may be doing. The president will run because he feels that he is the best person to continue the progress that we have made in this country.
We'll be watching and listening. Anita Dunn, thank you for your time this morning. We'll be right back. For some analysis on the election and its impact, we are joined now by a panel of political pros. Etienne, a CBS political contributor and a former aide to Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi. Joel Payne is a Democratic strategist and also a CBS political contributor. Leslie Sanchez is a Republican strategist and also part of the team here at CBS. And Brendan Buck is a former top aide to Speakers Paul Ryan and John Boehner. It's good to have you all here. And I know you're going to explain everything that happened. But Brendan, I want to start with you. We were just hearing about how slim the majorities could be if the GOP does pull off this win in the House. Conservative Republicans from within the Freedom Caucus made your last two bosses' lives very, very difficult. What is it that Kevin McCarthy would face if he steps into leadership of the Republican Party in the House?
Yeah, it's a really difficult moment. When we had trouble sometimes keeping everybody in line, we had a pretty healthy majority, sometimes 10, 15, 30 seats. This is a situation where you could have 2 seats to play with, and that's almost an impossible. Being a Republican Speaker of the House is impossible to begin with. But with a 2-seat majority, what that allows is every single member has enormous leverage over the Speaker of the House. And that's what they're starting to assert on him. They are trying to say, if you want my vote to be Speaker, you have to do things the way that I want them to be done. And all that does is weaken the Speaker. And a weak Speaker only helps Democrats. But each one of these people don't really seem to care much about leadership. They get a lot of their power. A rank-and-file Republican gets a lot of their power by attacking leadership. And it plays to the base and the grassroots. So we're in this cycle where they're just going to keep attacking each other. They're going to benefit. All it's going to do is hurt the Speaker. And ultimately, I don't know that much is going to get done legislatively. But these oversight investigations are still going to be going forward. All you need is one more seat. So I still think it's going to be a pretty active, busy House.
So, Ashley, to that point, one Democratic strategist said to me, because of what Brendan described, it's going to be a knife fight for 2 years. And you don't put someone untested in the leadership role on the Democratic side. That sounded to me like Speaker Pelosi at 82 years old is staying in Congress.
Well, I'll just say this. If we take a step back, I was just thinking how to describe.
You don't want to say if she's staying or not.
No, I do. I'm happy to get into it. But I was just, as a Democrat, I just want to sort of absorb this moment that we're currently in. I was thinking, I'm not a linguist, but there's got to be something worse than a shellacking that happens on Tuesday. No, I think that the Speaker is in the power position. I mean, I've always known the Speaker to be in a power position. But after the results, we overperformed in the election. There was no wave. This really solidifies her legacy as the most accomplished Speaker in American history, in my opinion. I think there's no doubt about that. But when she recently gave an interview and she basically said this morning, listen, we're still in this fight. Let's not make any assumptions. Let's hold off on it. I'm always willing to bet on the Speaker. But there's 2 things I know about her. 1, she's going to make her decision on her own terms. And 2, she's going to keep us all guessing.
Mm-hmm. And on her own terms after this horrendous attack on her husband recently,
yes.
Which says a lot. Joel, we were talking with Senator Cotton about the other question of leadership over in the Senate, where Democrats have this razor-thin majority. What is going on, from your understanding, within the ranks, and I want Leslie to jump in too, of leadership on the Senate side?
Well, I think it's pretty stable on the Senate side. If you're a Democrat, you got to feel really good about Chuck Schumer delivering on that Democratic agenda, particularly in the last kind of quarter of the last Congress. You got someone like Gary Peters, who ran the Democratic campaign machine to a lot of aplomb. You've got a really strong, experienced leadership core. So I actually think that, you know, for maybe, gosh, Ashley, we've got relative peace of prosperity in the Democratic leadership ranks of the Senate, which I think is,
by the way.
and in the House, by the way. She knows I'm a Senate guy. But yeah, I actually think it's a time of a lot of peace. And by the way, Chuck Schumer, probably among the winners when you look at what happened this week, leaning into that kind of Democratic agenda. By the way, Biden Democrats did well. And there's a lot of Biden Democrats in that Senate caucus.
Well, the best he can get done if Republicans take the House is to confirm some judicial nominees.
So
is that it for
interesting,
the next few years?
I've been talking to some folks, some high-ranking Democrats, and they'll tell you we're going to double down on prescription drugs. We're going to go after insulin pricing. We're going to try to codify Roe. We're going to keep pursuing anti-inflationary measures. Well, that's why that race in Georgia becomes really important, because in an era where Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema exist, and also when you have Dianne Feinstein in your caucus, who is a little older, it helps to have that extra insurance of another vote.
Mm-hmm. I think the only assurance coming out of that is going to be judicial appointments, because everything else is going to be really difficult, especially if you're talking about an economic agenda and getting Republicans to come on board. And Margaret, I'm just going to jump in since I started on this part. I want to say about Tuesday, Republicans were expecting a revolution. They got a revelation. And the revelation is a lot about the impact of women voters in this area and how they are activated. We know from 2018 and 2020 that with a sense of urgency, you see women run, donate, protest, and get engaged. Comes the Dobbs decision, Supreme Court Dobbs decision in June, it did have that impact that a lot of Republicans are not talking about in areas that mattered, whether it was a ballot initiative or something you had like Michigan, or a suburban area like Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And the second part of that, we did see positive sides with women and the Republican Party when it came to strong governance, or when governors who looked like they were really holding the line, whether they were male or female, they were rewarded by those suburban white women, and also working class Latino and white women. So I think there's a big takeaway that gets lost in this conversation, and that will be a part of the agenda moving forward.
So let's talk about that in the governor's mansions. So in addition to Florida's Governor DeSantis, other Republican governors who signed abortion restrictions into law also won re-election. I'm thinking of Ohio's DeWine, Brian Kemp, Georgia, Greg Abbott in Texas. They all won by significant margins. Then you look at those who won with healthy backing from women: DeSantis, Abbott, Sununu, DeWine. These Republicans won women.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't about abortion.
No.
What was it about?
The economic issue overall. I mean, so single issue voters, people that were voting on abortion, in those critical swing areas, they made the difference. But if you back up, you take an aggregate view of a state like Florida, for example, when it was important to get people back to work, you have a lot of working class families who didn't have the luxury of working from home, that realized their small businesses need to keep moving. And tourism was a big part of Florida's industry. Getting that going helped. He was rewarded dramatically. And you have a lot of small business owners that are women who cared about those types of issues. So that's a very good model. But if it's an extreme model, I would say on one side or the other, is when you get a lot, mostly white, college-educated women who come out against those extremes. And in many cases, the extreme can be a Donald Trump. He activates women to respond. The counter response is visceral, one way or the other. And I've been speaking to some Maga supporters, some loyalists on his side, and they say, while they still love the former president, the thrill is gone. They are tired of the big ego and the name calling, and I think it's a caution for the Republican Party.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Leslie, I think that's the top takeaway. The question that remains is when are Republicans going to learn the lesson? The MAGA movement has been a loser since day one. You've lost 3 cycles now in a big way. There's calls inside and outside the party for Republicans to take back their party. Rupert Murdoch and all his properties are sort of abandoning the president. And so for me, it's the party, the Republican Party, is at a crossroads now. The question is, what are you going to do? And I think the challenge for them, the problem is, you can't win with the MAGA movement, but you can't walk away from them. As you said earlier, Margaret, there's 150 of them that are in the House caucus, and then the former president, is suggesting that he's going to run again. He's omnipresent in this whole debate. So that's really the challenge. And I think in the next week, it's going to be interesting to see if the MAGA movement sort of loosens its grip on the GOP going forward. I mean, it's a big, big week for Republicans coming coming up in terms of their organizing. But that's the real question. When are you going to learn the lessons?
And I don't know that we will. I mean, how many times have we been given the opportunity to learn the lesson after January 6th? And we've had leaders say it's time to turn the page. Mitch McConnell was on the Senate floor. Kevin McCarthy was on the Senate floor saying it's time to move on.
Yeah.
But every time that runs into voters, and voters aren't ready to move on. And so we could have another moment where all the people in Washington say we want somebody else. But if voters don't, they're probably going to backtrack very quickly. I thought your interview with Tom Cotton was fascinating earlier. He was saying, as much as all of us could hear, he wants somebody else to be the nominee. He's name dropping other people that he wants to be the nominee. But he wouldn't say it's time to move on for Trump.
Sure.
Right.
Because they can't do that, because you're going to lose base Republican voters. We have an example of this in the Senate race. Joe Day, who is running in Colorado, was running a really great race, everybody thought, and he was doing it a little different than you usually see. He was saying, I'm not a Trump Republican, and was trying to say, like, I'm appealing to a middle. He pissed off Donald Trump. Donald Trump attacked him, and he lost significantly because Trump voters ran away from him.
A Trump advisor, I asked, because they are planning this announcement on Tuesday for the former president to announce his candidacy. I asked, but don't you need to show unity with the party since you have this Senate race in Georgia? And the answer was, it's unity with the base that we are showing. So is he forcing a question?
I just think that's mistaken. Also, I love all this, deep introspection of the Republican Party, but I do think you should think about Democrats here, particularly President Biden. So, talking to folks who are pretty familiar with the
Because
president's
you're saying
thinking,
they didn't lose, you won.
That's what I'm saying. If you talk to people who are familiar with the president's
You're
thinking,
curve, though. You
they
know
will.
that.
I am. They will tell you that the Biden coalition is pretty durable. It showed up obviously in 2020. It looks like it showed up mostly here. College educated, young voters, Latinos, particularly in some of those areas where we thought they wouldn't show up, African Americans, independents being competitive with them. That coalition showed up in 20, showed up in 22, and I think they think it could show up in 24. Also, candidate quality matters. Some of the folks that you referenced, those are some of your better Republican candidates.
Right.
The reason why Republicans struggled, I would say, is because the candidate quality imbalance was way in the favor of Democrats.
Most of those candidates endorsed by the former president.
I was to say, on the fundamentals, people would say that the Trump coalition, very much to this point, is going to show up, that it is very strong. What I'm saying is different. 2016, it was refreshing to have somebody like Donald Trump, and now it is more like fatigue post a pandemic. And these are their words, not mine. And that's why I think the cautionary wind.
But pick up, would you, on what Joel was talking about with Hispanic voters? Because I know you've been looking at this very carefully in Texas, and you think Democrats shouldn't bank on that.
Absolutely not, because what we saw is there is a transformation that's happening with working class Latino families. They're not necessarily on the education line, but on the income line. If they're moving out to those exurbs, those suburban areas, those rural areas in red precincts, they are breaking the way of Republicans increasingly, married families, very traditional in that sense, that feel they may still self-identify as a Democrat, but they feel the party has left them. That's an opportunity, and Republicans closed that gap by 50% this last cycle.
I agree with that. Republicans do have an opportunity there. And I think, by the way, both sides would be, they would be wise to not overcorrect to either of their kind of farthest bases. I think there is an agenda, the Biden agenda, that works, that's proven to work. I think you'll see a lot of Democrats who are maybe late adopters who will be a little bit more eager to jump on that Biden agenda. And I actually think there's probably a muted Biden coalition out there that doesn't get represented in the public opinion polling and a lot of the public discussion that, again, I think it does show up pretty reliably.
But Joel, let's talk about what actually did work for the Republicans. Tom Cotton mentioned Kemp and DeSantis. Both of those two candidates and governors ran away from Trump and ran away from the Maga movement. So I love that we're having this debate, but it seems divorced of the reality that there was not a wave and that there doesn't need to be some corrections on the part of the Republicans, and that the playbook has been laid out. And I think DeSantis and Kemp have laid it out.
Ashley, let me ask you about 2024, Democrats' playbook.
Feels good.
Vice President Harris was out there talking a lot about reproductive health.
I think
health. Did she deserve any credit for this? Because we don't talk about her much in the realm of 2024.
Yeah, she actually, I will start by saying I expect that the president will run in 2024, and I think he should. I mean, he's got an incredible record. He's defied all expectation, all odds. He's probably the most underestimated politician in recent history. But in terms of the vice president, she did yeoman's work in, I think the number is like 36 states talking about abortion and women's rights, reproductive rights and democracy. So she had a really big impact on the ground that doesn't really bubble up to Washington, but really drove people out and drove local stories and energy on the ground. So I just expect the president will run, and he should.
With the vice president on the
Oh,
ticket,
absolutely.
the number 2
Yeah, of course.
Just have to ask. We're talking a lot about 2024 since it starts. Really, right now, frankly, and gets underway. Just very quickly, before we go, Joel, closing thought from you on what clinched it in Pennsylvania.
Well, what clinched in Pennsylvania, it looks like, was abortion. If you look at the exit polling, abortion outperformed inflation. Doesn't mean inflation is not important, but it does mean that Democrats, as Anthony referred to earlier in the show, did hit a chord with abortion that really resonated with voters.
All right. Good to have all of you here in person to talk. We'll be back in a moment. In these challenging times, we pause to reflect and thank those in the military for their service and sacrifice, as we do each November. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, fighting in World War I stopped. The war to end all wars did not prevent a global one 20 years later. Again and again and again, American servicemen and women have continued to sacrifice, defending against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Today, less than 10% of American adults are military veterans, according to the VA. Just 1% of adults serve on active duty. That makes it hard for most to relate to combat survivors battling traumatic stress. Retired Army Colonel Chris Kalenda, who served 4 combat tours in Afghanistan, told me that he has lost more of his unit to suicide and substance abuse than he did to enemy fire. How should people ask veterans about their service?
Tell me about your service. What was the best experience you ever had? What was the most awesome thing about your service? I mean, those sort of very safe questions, very positive questions, are just easy ones that get people talking.
Simply trying to understand is one way to honor the dead and serve the living. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.